Welcome to tonight's event, Political Repression in the Philippines. My name is Mia, and I am a member of the research team here at the People's Forum, which is a popular and political education space based in New York City. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am excited and honored to be joined by our wonderful speakers, Cam Diligente from Center for Trade Union and Human Rights in the Philippines, Father Rolando Abejo of Calo Maran, an alliance of indigenous peoples in the Mindanao Island, and Nikki Pagulayan of Anak Bayan, USA. I would also like to thank both Louis Sawi and Tiffany Bibold of the New York for Philippine Human Rights Act Coalition for building this event with me. The region of Southeast Asia, from the Philippines to Indonesia, has a long history of campaigns of terror against the working class and forceful suppression of national liberation resistance movements, often in the name of fighting communism and always with the support of Western nations. However, we know that these campaigns are used against the peoples of the world to secure the power of the ruling class and to maintain the global capitalist system. The current Duterte regime has used the newly passed anti-terror law to indiscriminately persecute workers, trade unionists, indigenous peoples, and whoever stands in the way of implementing his extractive and harmful neoliberal policies. Those of us tuning in from the US are not unfamiliar with intense political repression and persecution. Legacies of European colonialism and US imperialism and the violent systems of punishment, imprisonment, and elimination used to maintain the dominant world order are, to this day, felt in countries across the globe, including right here in the imperial core. With the world continuing to battle a global pandemic and the current crisis of vaccine apartheid, it has only become more apparent that the struggles of the global working class must be united. The freedom of the Filipino people is our freedom. We at the People's Forum believe that the passage of the Philippine Human Rights Act would set an important precedent for withdrawal of US military funding from countries around the world. We believe this would be a step towards withdrawing the control and force of American imperialism. My comrade, Louis from New York for FRA, will provide a bit more context and introduce the act and how to get involved. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia, for providing that short introduction. So since 2016, the Philippines has been under the thumb of brutal fascist regime led by President Rodrigo Duterte. And throughout these past 5 years, this violence has been at the hands of the Philippine National Police, the Armed Forces of the Philippines, and anonymous murderers who are never held to account for their actions. These brutal tactics have led to the deaths of over 30,000 people since Duterte took office. There have been over 376 extrajudicial killings, over 2,600 illegal arrests, and over 1,040 illegal imprisonments. Because the Philippines is also rich in natural resources and land, the Philippine government has been in cahoots with various multinational corporations that's led to the exploitation of the land, which has led to the displacement of over 450,000 people from their homes and ancestral lands. The Anti-Terror Law, in which this upcoming Saturday marks 1 year since its passage, broadened the Philippine government's reach to go after essentially anyone that criticizes the Duterte regime. Since 2016, our U.S. government has provided the Philippines with over $550 million in military aid to commit these human rights abuses against the Filipino people. So in response to this human rights crisis, members of Kabataan Alliance, the Malaya Movement, and the U.S. network of the International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines, also known as ICHRP, came together in the spring of 2019 to lobby U.S. Congress for a hearing featuring the human rights situation in the Philippines, alongside a resolution condemning the Duterte's attacks on human rights defenders. And although these lobbying efforts have led to few successes, such as Congress introducing a bipartisan bill condemning Duterte's administration, targeting of political opponents, and city councils, like in San Francisco, where they passed a resolution to call for the suspension of military aid to the Philippines. The Duterte regime continues to commit these human rights atrocities through the Philippine National Police and the Armed Forces of the Philippines, including the brutal murders of indigenous Lumad Manobo farmers, really Rodriguez, Lenny Rivas, and Angel Rivas. And last week, under the Biden administration, the U.S. State Department approved a potential $2.5 billion arms sales to the Philippines. You know, we can't continue to allow the U.S. government to continue funding these killings, displacement, and imprisonment of Filipinos. And more importantly, we must not remain silent about it. That is why we must support the passage of the Philippine Human Rights Act through U.S. Congress, which would suspend U.S. tax dollars from funding the Philippine military and police forces until human rights violations by the mentioned forces end and responsible state forces are held accountable. So join us. Join your local iChirp US, Malaya Movement, and Kabataan Alliance chapters to get involved in the campaign to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act. You can find them by visiting humanrightsph.org. But if you live in New York, I ask you to join us, the New York NY for FRA, NY for PHRA Coalition, New York for FRA, a movement that's campaigning to get all New Yorkers to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act. You can contact us at ny4phra@gmail.com. But you can also find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. So, with that said, we have these speakers who are going to provide much more context and in-depth their own experiences encountering the fascist regime of Duterte. And the first person I'd like to introduce is Cams Dilehente.
Hello, good evening and good morning to everyone. And we thank you for inviting us to be part of this significant event today. It is very timely, as mentioned by Louis. The attacks in the Philippines, the repression in the Philippines has been intensified, especially during this pandemic. The pandemic was used to further the attacks on the people. And I am here to discuss about the situation of trade union and human rights in the Philippines, how this repression translates to the trade union movement. Yeah. Amidst this worst economic and human rights crisis, just some quick facts. The unemployment rate today is at 8.7%. There's a massive loss of jobs and livelihood. Even before the pandemic, the creation of jobs has been the slowest in the recent years. The inflation rate is at its worst. And of course, the poor pandemic response is highlighted. There's insufficient government aid for those affected, and the medical response of the government is very poor. Amidst all this, the government is more busy in dealing with attacks against rights defenders and furthering the shrinking democratic space in the country. The Philippines is considered as one of the worst countries for workers. It has been consistent in the past 4 years of the Duterte regime. We're always included in the top 10 worst countries for workers, as according to this study of the International Trade Union Confederation, its Global Rights Index. And as mentioned here, in the context of extreme violence and suppression of liberties, employers' tactics to label unions as subversive organizations, in a process commonly called as red tagging, expose their members to violence and repression. The next 4 slides are some of the policies of the Duterte regime that we think contributed to the worsening situation of trade union rights in the Philippines. Of course, there's the martial law in Mindanao, which gave way to the repression of various trade unions in different plantations across Mindanao. One of the victims of killings is a trade unionist of the banana plantation, the multinational banana plantation, Sumifru Corporation. He's Danny Boy Bautista. He was killed amidst the workers' strikes in 2018. And of course, there's the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict. This was created in 2018, and since then it has been the main instrument of the Duterte regime in red tagging and formulating other programs to uh, to so-called combat terrorism, but in fact they are actually tagging everyone, almost everyone, as communist or as terrorist, priests, members of different organizations, and even those who are just supporting the different causes and criticizing, and they are also tagged as terrorists. There's this JIPCO, particularly for the labor sector. This is a great concern. This was created just a little before the pandemic. It is a joint industrial peace and concerns office. It was also created through the NTF-LCAC. It is used as it is created under the pretense of maintaining industrial peace in economic zones. But they also explicitly said that it is created to combat radical unionism. So it is very against the freedom of association of workers. Basically, it involves deployment of more police, more state forces in different economic zones. And they actually have different programs. They hold seminars, and they set up offices in different economic zones. And of course, the military's lockdown, instead of a medical response to the pandemic, of course, Duterte enforced the military's lockdown. It was more involved in imprisoning or punishing quarantine violators rather than strengthening the health system. So he was actually ordering his troops to shoot them dead, those who will violate the quarantine protocols. And of course, as mentioned earlier, the Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020, it was railroaded last year. It was a very fast process. The pandemic was really used to protect this, to have this passed, no? Because the mobility of the people to mobilize, no, to hold protest against it were limited. But despite this, a lot of protest was held in the Philippines. But still, because they have the numbers in the legislative branch, they were able to pass this as a law. But until now, they aren't able to use this to its full extent because of the wide opposition of the people. Up to now, there are pending oppositions in the Supreme Court. So these are some of the examples of how workers, unionists, and labor rights defenders are being attacked in the Philippines. Of course, there's a red tagging and vilification. The red tagging of unionists, labor organizers, and other rights defenders is at its worst. In the past years, it was like it's somehow subtle or discreet. They do it in seminars, but now it's everywhere. It's in social media. It's in the walls in different areas. It's in tarpaulins in major roads. So, and anyone can be tagged in this posters. of red tagging. Yeah. All forms of media, mainstream media, seminars, social media, wall postings. They use it to spread their red tagging propaganda against unionists and, of course, other rights defenders. And as you can see in the picture below, red tagging nakamamatay, or in English, red tagging kills, because in our experience, a lot of the victims of political killings in the country have experienced red tagging in different forms. There are also reported cases of forced surrender. This one in particular is in Coca-Cola in Santa Rosa, Laguna. On May 1 last year, 16 workers were presented to the media like this. They were presented as rebel surrenderies, but actually they are just workers. They are unionists who were terrified because of continuous harassment from elements of the NTF-LCAC. They are being used as props for further red tagging and vilification of unionists. There's also intimidation, harassment, and intensified surveillance. We have been receiving reports of agents of NTF-LCAC visiting unionists in their homes, intimidating them and harassing them to disaffiliate and turn their back against their unions. There are also reported police presence in different offices. And of course, before the pandemic, where strikes can still be held, there were violent dispersal of worker strikes. The first one in the picture is in Sumifru, Philippines Corporation in Compostela Valley. Their picket lines were burned after the dispersal. The second one is Nutri Asia, Philippines, where it was a bloody dispersal. And the third one is in Pepmaco, the maker of laundry detergent in Laguna. There's also direct intervention of state forces to union affairs. This is in one of the factories in Bulacan. The military really enters the premises of the factory, and they intervene in union elections, and they, of course, terrify the workers to not participate or to choose the pro-management union. And of course, there are illegal arrests, weaponized mostly by court-issued warrants. There's planting of evidence and trumped-up charges. In the past 5 years, more than 200 workers, unionists, and labor organizers were arrested in protests, strikes, and raids. Usually in the cases of the raids, where activists or unionists are arrested, search warrants or arrest warrants are used. No, these are usually issued by, I think, of course, cohorts of the Duterte regime, no, in the courts, and then they plant evidence. Sometimes the location of the grenade or the firearm is really ridiculous. It's in very conspicuous places, beside under the pillow or in the window. It's as crazy as that. And of course, they are arrested and charges are filed against them. Yeah, even those who are simply asking for government aid amid widespread unemployment and hunger were arrested and jailed. This is Tatay Elmer, a jeepney driver who was one of the Piston six drivers arrested when they were asking for aid and demanding for the jeepney operations to be returned. And these are the 21 urban poor who were just looking for aid, and they were also violently dispersed and arrested. The quarantine protocols were also used to quell protests. More than 150 were arrested in protest during the pandemic. Under the Duterte regime, there are currently 31 political prisoners from the ranks of workers, unionists, and labor rights defenders. These are one of them. This is the HR Day 7. They were arrested in simultaneous operations last Human Rights Day last year. Two of them are actually freed already, and as their cases were dismissed, but the rest are still in prison. As I mentioned earlier, the narrative used for them is the same. They were raided early in the morning, evidence were planted, and they were charged with non-bailable cases. These are some of the currently detained unionists and labor rights defenders. This is Paul Villuya of Central Luzon, and this is Laguna 5. One of them is actually freed already, Elizabeth Camoral, but the other 4 remains in different jails in the southern Tagalog region. These are from different sectors. One of this is a longtime union leader of Honda. 2 of them are government employees unionists. Going to the extrajudicial killings, as of now, there are 56 out of the figure mentioned by Louis earlier. 56 is coming from the farm workers, informal workers, unionists, and other labor rights defenders. Some of them are here. Ariel Diaz is a farm worker in Isabela. Francisco Guevara is president of a union. Of course, Carlito Badion, he was brutally killed last year. And there's also a union president killed early this year. And of course, the Bloody Sunday Massacre. It was really a horrible day. This March 7, 9 activists were killed in the conduct of simultaneous police operations, while 4 others were arrested. We were able to visit one of the victims, this longtime leader, Manny Asuncion. Right after he was killed, it was really a traumatic experience for his family and his comrades and friends. They were raided early in the morning, and they were begging to be just taken and charged with whatever they will be charged. But he was not spared, and the police was really there to kill him because his wife was spared. No, he was with his wife and another leader of an organization, but they were spared. They were asked to stay at the first level of the office, and just a few minutes after, they heard gunshots, and as he was begging for his life, he was killed. It was really traumatic because he was killed in an office, but the search warrant for him was served in his house where 2 of his children were there, and they experienced the planting of evidence and of course the harassment from the state forces. And the most recent is the brutal killing of Dandy Miguel. He was the union president of Fuji Electric Philippines, a very young unionist who is very well loved and popular in the southern Tagalog region. He was just coming home from work, riding his motorcycle. He was stopped by some still unknown men and was killed on the spot. It was just learned by his family and friends when someone, concerned citizen, posted his picture in social media asking him to be identified. These attacks are causing, of course, great fear for the workers and unionists. But despite this, they still continue with their work because they have to. If no one will do this, the regime, the state forces, will continue doing so. So despite these relentless attacks, the resistance of the workers and the people continues. Some unions, some workers are still able to gain some victories. New unions, we receive reports of new unions being formed despite the fear, despite this climate of repression. There are also victories for some unions through their collective bargaining agreements, even amid the pandemic. It's really quite amazing, the resilience of the people and their commitment to fight for their rights. So here are just some of the pictures. And yeah, the resistance continues amidst these attacks. That's all for me now, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Combs. We are honored that you are here to share these experiences with us. And now we will go to Father Abejo, who will speak about the context of Mindanao.
Good evening, everyone. I'm happy and glad that I can present the story of the people here in Mindanao, especially the Lumads and peasant situation, the political repression of the people. This is the story of my two close friends, Jomrito Guainon and Ireneo Odarbi. Jomorito Guainon is a tribal chieftain or datu of the Higaonon indigenous peoples tribe. Ireneo Odarbi is a peasant leader. On January 28, 2019, they were arrested based on planted evidence that they were carrying explosives and firearms. Their arrest was kept secret until we resorted to social media. Jomorito was charged under the original version of the Anti-Terrorism Law. Ireneo was arrested based on an already dismissed warrant of arrest for murder. Ireneo had been released from jail last year, but Jomorito is still detained. I knew them because we hosted their office in our church, the Iglesia Filipina Independiente. I speak to you today on behalf of Jomorito and Ireneo because their voices are being silenced. What does the story of Jomorito and Ireneo symbolize? Jomorito and Ireneo are only 2 out of 700 activists in Mindanao facing fabricated criminal charges by the government. Jomorito is one of the 16 Lumad leaders in prison. He is the vice chairperson of Kalumaran, the biggest alliance of Lumad organization in Mindanao. Almost all officers of Kalumaran are facing trumped-up charges. Some are imprisoned and others have been killed. The same is true for Ireneo and other peasants leaders in Mindanao. Indigenous and peasants advocates are not spared as well. What are the main forms of political repression against peasant and Lumads in Mindanao? 1. Extensive detention of Lumad leaders and IP advocates all over Mindanao. Number 2, these arrests and detention are based on the widespread criminalization of leaders and advocates through trumped-up charges. 3. Shutting down of almost all alternative Lumad schools in Mindanao. More than 250 indigenous schools have been forcibly closed by the government, affecting more than 5,000 students and teachers. This as 9 for every 10 Lumad children are out of school. Number 4, targeted conversion of IP leaders, school personnel, parents, and Lumad students by the military through threat, bribes, or blackmail. Number 5, forced and fake surrenders of community and organization members as rebels. 6, massive human rights and international human rights violation due to militarization. This military operation had been using advanced and extremely harmful and indiscriminate war technology, such as Agusta attack helicopters and drones. 7. The use of the COVID-19 pandemic to cover up the attacks and arrest of IP leaders and advocates to prevent mass evacuation from militarization and military encampment. This causes difficulty in documenting HRV's cases in far-flung communities due extensive lockdown. Number 8, red tagging of the term lumad as a political identity, alleging it was coined by the CPP and PA, when in fact it arose from the lumad themselves through conferences supported by the Catholic churches in Mindanao in the 1980s. 9. Conscious prevention of solidarity action from support group and advocates by red tagging them, stopping community pantries, and using the revised anti-terrorism law as blanket threat to individuals and groups. Why are the likes of Jumorito and Ireneo being silenced? What have they done? Jumorito and Ireneo, the lumad and peasant leaders and advocates, have been waging resistance of land grabbing and encroachment on ancestral domains and peasant lands. Peasants leaders have also led action to reclaim, occupy, and develop abandoned lands or those granted to them under previous agrarian reform programs, but are continually denied from them. Jumorito and Ireneo have led the annual Manila Bayan, or Indigenous and Peasant Caravan and protest camp from Manila or Mindanao to Manila. This mobilization of thousands of lumad, Moro, and poor farmers have shaken the capital, dominated the political narrative, arousing, organizing, and mobilizing schools and universities, churches, and the mainstream and social media. In the communities, the likes of Jumorito and Ireneo have exposed military operation and abuses. In many areas, they have stopped the intrusion of logging, mining, and plantation companies. In South Cotabato, an open-pit mining ban has been adopted by local governments upon the solid lobby of lumad and peasant leaders and advocates. Why does the Duterte government hardly or badly want to repress the lumad and peasants? The persistent resistance of the lumad and peasant in Mindanao have frustrated many profit-making and extractive projects and programs of the government and capitalists. Ancestral lands and peasants area are the country's remaining last frontier, but the fertile lands abound. River systems like Pulangi are potential for energy extraction. Mindanao is rich in mineral deposits that ranks top in the world. There are 67,000 hectares of land targeted for coal deposits. That is why the Amdap Valley complex is being targeted, and the recent massacre of the three Manubos there has happened due to military operations. There are 2 million hectares of land targeted for oil palm plantation in Mindanao. The MNC, the TNC companies like Dole and Del Monte are expanding their agribusiness plantation. There are more than 500,000 hectares given to the large-scale mining plantation. The Tampakan mining in South Cotabato is one of the biggest gold mining projects in the world, with more than $5 billion of potential revenues. That is why 75% of combat forces of the armed forces of the Philippines are deployed in Mindanao, precisely to protect these interests. And these forces virtually serve as private guard of these MNCs, TNCs, and big local companies. The AFP and PNP are supported by the United States government through training, war equipment, and indoctrination in counterinsurgency. It is the #1 enabler of the Duterte's abuses against Lumad and peasants. What are our calls? Our calls are centered on 3 slogans. #1, stop Lumad killings, resist militarization, state terrorism and plunder in ancestral domain. #2, free our Lumad leaders, drop Trump up charges. #3, stop the attacks on Lumad schools, uphold indigenous rights to education and self-determination. We include a special call, stop U.S. military aid to the Duterte regime. These calls are part of the overall multi-sectoral call, U.S. Duterte Wakasana, or end the U.S. Duterte regime now. Based on these calls, we waged 3 campaigns. 1, the Indigenous People's Human Rights Campaign, the Legal Support and Mitsa Legal Campaign to free our Lumad leaders and drop Trump up charges. 3, Save Our School Campaign. 4, internationalization of Lumad and peasants issue. The Magalayon heroism is carried on by Jumorito and Ireneo. We must admit that the overall impact of political repression is a weakening of Lumad and peasant communities, organization, and leaders. But despite this, their will to fight and overcome continues to be strong and resolute. Jumorito and Ireneo's spirit are still high and solid. This is because Lumad and peasants, especially in Mindanao, have a long history of struggle against colonization and neo-colonization. They are inspired by Magalayon, the Lumad leader who assassinated the highest-ranking American military officers in the early 1900s. My friends, Jumorito and Ireneo are today's Mangulayon. And I'm asking you to learn more about Mangulayon's heroism. So please join our webinar on August 11. Thank you. Daghang salamat.
Thank you so much, Father Abejo. Thank you for showing us the relationship between political repression and the extraction of Philippines' natural resources. Next, we'll be going to Nikki with Anak Bayan USA.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Nikki Pagulayan, and I am a National Officer of Anak Bayan USA. Thank you to our previous speakers, Ken of the Center for Trade Union and Human Rights, and to Father Rolando Obejo of Kalumaran, and to the People's Forum in New York for hosting this panel today in light of the 1-year anniversary of the Fascist Anti-Terror Act that was passed last July. The mass movement of Filipinos and allies in the US against the Duterte regime is not exempt from the administration's counterinsurgency tactics. It is because of the strengthening and broadening of the overseas movement for freedom and democracy in the Philippines, because of the work to pass the Philippine Human Rights Act and cut US funding to state killings and human rights violations in the Philippines, has meant more direct attacks against grassroots organizations here in the US. So what I'll be speaking about tonight is how the Duterte administration's counterinsurgency war has expanded overseas, its different tactics in recent years, and the US's complicity in Duterte's fascism. Over the past 4 years, the US Duterte regime has implemented several counterinsurgency plans, with the most recent being Oplan Kapanatagan, or Operation Plan Stability, which is essentially a joint AFP and PNP campaign, or the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police campaign, that was launched in 2019 to launch a whole of nation approach, meaning that all civilian agencies, government departments, to wage this counterinsurgency war and render support for the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC, which is to wage or to lead essentially this counterinsurgency war and tag all activists and ordinary people, as Cam said earlier. And part of this whole nation approach has been to organize government entities into different clusters, including an international engagement cluster and a strategic communications cluster, both of which play a key role in waging this war on the overseas movement, especially here in the US. The former criminalizing dissent and undermining the work of grassroots organizations by tagging them as terrorists and communist threats, and the other reinforcing the tagging by creating fake news and employing and mobilizing its troll army to disseminate this fake news and create an illusion that it's true. Some of these tactics employed by the Duterte government and by the administration and the NTF-LCAC has exposed itself in quite a number of ways. In October 2018, here in New York City, the Philippine National Police held a town hall at the Philippine Consulate in New York to promote its Global Police Community Relations Program to deploy PNP to outposts here in the United States, in San Francisco and somewhere on the East Coast, to continue its harassment, intimidation, and surveillance of peace and human rights organizations, activists, and community members based here in the US who voice criticism over Duterte's violent and anti-people policies. Filipinos on both coasts of the US denounced the setting up of these PNP outposts as part of its attempt to improve its image abroad in the wake of tens of thousands that were killed by the PNP and vigilantes under Duterte's drug war. Something else of note is that the security forces of the Philippines have also established working relations with law enforcement and intelligence agencies here in the US, where the PNP and the New York Police Department have an established memorandum of understanding since 2012, creating a direct line of communication between the two agencies. So the NYPD has an explicit role to help build the capacity of the PNP by offering training, providing technology, setting up a satellite office in the Philippines. And since that time, the PNP has committed countless extrajudicial killings, including actively engaging in leading the war on drugs, killing upwards of 30,000 people. And it's in the same time period that we have also seen the New York Police Department similarly commit numerous extrajudicial killings, particularly against Black and Brown people here. And both security forces have repeatedly fought efforts against reform. If the past 9 years has shown us anything, it's that the sharing of information and resources between these security forces hasn't led to any benefit for the people of the Philippines or the people here in New York. And it's only going to show that this will only lead to further targeting and persecution of those attempting to institute substantial reforms through policing. Other examples of these counterinsurgency tactics are, in 2019, the Presidential Communications Operations Office, in coordination with consulates across the US, led a speaking tour in working with the disingenuous Mindanao Indigenous Peoples Council of Elders, or MIPSO, who have since been exposed as having a history of betraying their own communities through paramilitary violence and the selling off of ancestral land for personal gain. This tour was used to vilify and red tag the Lumad, who are fighting for their right to education and land back home, but they were also used to vilify and red tag progressive organizations here supporting that right, including Anak Bayang USA, supporting the Indigenous Lumad fight for self-determination. Other tactics also include, similar to what was shared earlier, social media being used to target organizations and activists overseas in the form of Facebook pages set up to target an overseas audience, posting counter propaganda against activist organizations called For the Global Public, and troll armies that flood posts of our organizations to discredit and mock them, red tagging and doxing of activists and organizations where images are put up claiming these organizations as communist fronts and their leaders as terrorists, including our friends in the Malaya movement, alliances such as Bayang USA, and organizations such as Gabriela USA and Anak Bayan USA that were terror tagged on the For the Global Public page, as well as the Presidential Communications Undersecretary Lorraine Badoy's personal Facebook page. I was among several national leaders who were also tagged as a terrorist organizer. And it's very clear now, as it was then, that this is meant to intimidate and quiet dissent abroad. And what is explicitly clear in all these tactics is that the US, as Father Abejos shared earlier, is the #1 supporter of these counterinsurgency tactics and this counterinsurgency war that has reached us overseas. It's important to recognize that when talking about the US role in supporting Duterte's fascism, we have to look at the long-standing history of US occupation and imperialism in the Philippines, and how today the Philippines may be sovereign in name, but not in reality. And this is expressed in how the Duterte government and every puppet government before it gets its counterinsurgency tactics and strategies from the US playbook, and that the US historically has continued to support these puppet governments in offering military, political, psychological, and economic methods of repression. We don't have time to go into that now, that's for another panel. But as the US continues to fall into a deeper economic and health crisis in light of the COVID crisis, we know that it's going to also tighten its leash on the Philippines to further exploit the country and its people, and will support any of its fascist tactics, the government's fascist tactics. So the vested support for Duterte's counterinsurgency war is most of all reflected in all of the money that the US government pours into the Duterte government and the security forces. Money reflects values, and particularly US foreign policy reflects US government's domestic policies. Therefore, what does it say about the US when billions of our taxpayer dollars are being pumped into militarization and repression of Filipino people, both in the Philippines and also here in the US, versus the social and economic relief desperately needed and called for during this health and economic crisis? Since 2016, the US has sent $550 million of aid to the Philippine military and police, not including arms sales. And in 2020, the US State Department made a $2 billion arms sale from weapons manufacturers from Boeing to Lockheed Martin to General Electric, with the Philippines that included attack helicopters, Hellfire missiles, rocket launchers, all these technical equipment meant to quote unquote flatten the revolutionary movement in the Philippines, to squash the movements defending land, livelihood, and self-determination, as shared earlier. And what we're seeing is that that's exactly what it's doing. It's funding the Philippine military and police that is silencing the people through imprisonment, torture, and death. Just last Friday, the US State Department approved a potential $2.5 billion arms sale to the Philippines that includes fighter aircraft, missiles, other equipment at the heels of Duterte's extension of the VFA, after Biden had written a letter to Duterte hoping for an extension. This was framed in a way to make it seem that it's meant to quote unquote improve the counterterrorism operations in the Philippines. But we know that what it's going to is the Philippine military and police's used to terrorize the Philippine masses, as exemplified by what was shared tonight: the Bloody Sunday massacre, the murder of Dandy Miguel, the Lianga 3 massacre, and the brutal killings of the 3 Lumang Manobo farmers, as seen earlier. All of these attacks and repression mentioned tonight were made possible because of our hard-earned taxpayer money that should be going to healthcare, education, housing, food, and overall social and economic security. But what is important to note is that these attacks are happening in the Philippines and here in the US because the mass movement is winning. These intensified attacks abroad show the strength of the overseas mass movement for liberation and democracy in the Philippines. And it won't back down and will never stop fighting along the millions of people across the Philippines who are fighting back in the front lines of this repression, violence, and death. That's why Anak Bayan USA calls on people to support and join organizations, calls on people to support and organizations to endorse the Philippine Human Rights Act, because we need to make the Biden administration accountable to its promise of not schmoozing the dictators worldwide, and accountable to holding up its promises to the people, redirecting these funds to the people across the US. We call on people to join organizations or coalitions like the New York RPRA to ensure that this becomes a reality, We call on people to join organizations that are also fighting for power independent of the US Duterte regime, because we know that the Filipino people will have more to defend once the Philippine Human Rights Act is passed and when Duterte is out of power. Doing this is an affirmation of one's commitment to the struggle of working in poor people against police violence, militarization, state-sanctioned terror in the Philippines and here in the US, and is one act of solidarity to the Philippines that can also have concrete impacts and relief to working and oppressed peoples here in the States. And if you're Filipino and you have had enough, you think 1 year Duterte is too much, is 1 year too long, and that he needs to be off now, then join the Wakasan Na movement to ensure he gets the boot for good. And lastly, join the People's State of the Nation address here in New York at the Philippine Consulate, or a Philippine or PSONA mobilization near you, to show that the Duterte regime, that it has every right to be afraid of the ever-strengthening people's movement for freedom and democracy in the Philippines from overseas. And US support for the Duterte regime now, pass the Philippine Human Rights Act, oust the US Duterte regime, Duterte Wakasan Na. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikki, for that presentation. I see that all the speakers have very expertly answered a lot of my questions that I had prepared for this event, which is amazing. And we might go over about 5 or 10 minutes, but if we could take the last 5 minutes for each speaker to answer and give a quick message about how, in the face of political persecution, both in the Philippines and abroad, if you could all share just a quick message about how you are finding hope and joy in this struggle, I think that I would like to hear about how the struggle can be both difficult and full of grief, but also a process of unity.
I can start us off. Hope. I think how it's been framed, to me at least, is a discipline in its own right, and it's one that is expressed through struggle, and that our struggle is an expression that our society can change. That the conditions that we're fighting against are not forever. They're not permanent, that they can be destroyed, that they can be taken down, as long as there are many, many people fighting against them. Rebuilding, building a society anew is a collective endeavor. So it never falls on one's shoulders alone. And that's where the hope really is being able to know that there are, tens, hundreds, thousands alongside you, and I guess from overseas, knowing that there are millions more on the front lines back home that are fighting, with so much joy and with so much hope in the face of so much difficulty. That is hope in and of itself. Yes, I guess I just answered that in short.
Salamat. Thank you. I am very glad na naririnig ang aming mga boses dito sa Mindanao para mapaabot sa ibayong bansa ang tunay na kalagayan. Kahit merong nangyayari din dyan na mga presyon, pero nagkakaisa ang mga tao para supilin ang mga nangdahas sa kanila. Sa akin, personally, we're very hoping na malagpasan itong pangyayaring ito. Dahil nakikita ng mamamayang Pilipino na dumadami ang nagkakaisa para mag-alsa, para patumbahin, no? Wakasan na itong karahasan na ginagawa ng gobyernong Duterte, no? Kahit maraming nakukulong na mga leaders, napapatay na mga leaders at iba pang mga formang pangdahas sa mga nag-alsa, meron pa ring titindig para ipagpatuloy ang naumpisahan ng mamamayang Pilipino para wakasan itong pagsasamantala. At salamat, no, sa pakikiisa, no, especially this occasion, no, na isang halimbawa, no, na kahit ang US community merong pagkakaisa sa mamamayang Pilipino para ipakita din at ipanawagan din, no, sa gobyerno ng US na i-stop, no, ang suportang militar, no, dito sa Pilipinas, especially, no, sa yung agreement ng US at Pilipinas sa BFA, no. Kaya kami, kahit tinatakot na, kahit nire-red tag na, kahit marami pang mga forma, hindi kami natatakot. Patuloy kaming lumalaban para sa buong kalayaan. Salamat sa okasyon na ito.
Thank you, Father Abejo.
Hello, yeah, it's my turn. Preventing tears from falling from the speech of Father Abejo. It's a really difficult time, no? The lockdown, of course, worsens the situation, and of course, the news of comrades falling into the hands of state terrorists, no, is a really difficult situation. But and of course, it's personally, it's also difficult for us as we have less opportunity to go to the ground with the workers, because of course their experiences of struggle and resistance is a source of great inspiration for us to continue and for us, of course, to persevere with the work that we do. But it's also very difficult as we have limited communication with them. Sometimes we just talk through the phone or through Zoom like this. It's a very alienating situation. But just recently, we were able to visit some of the unions in Laguna, and it was inspiring because, as I mentioned earlier, they were able to gain some victories amidst the continuous attacks that they received, especially last March. No, they are really one of the regions and areas that has been really strongly attacked. They continue to gain victories. They continue with their regular activities despite all this, despite the lockdown, despite the fear to contract the disease, and of course, despite the threat to their lives. I think that's where most of us get our strength, no, and our inspiration to continue amidst this climate of repression and injustice in the country. And also, we appreciate this kind of activities, and we appreciate the support for fellow Filipinos and other citizens of other countries to the struggles of the Filipino people. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our guest speakers. And to end, I will be passing it to Tiffany to give us a little bit of a reminder about how we can get involved and more about the FRA Act.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Maraming salamat to everybody who showed up and got up really early to be here. on the other side of the planet. Thank you. So if you are local to the New York for Frock Coalition, meaning you're based in New York, please consider joining us. Consider joining the New York for Frock Coalition, the local chapters of iChirp, Kabataan Alliance, Malaya Movement, Bayan and Anak Bayan. Get on our social media outlets, get on our mailing lists. All of us have really awesome newsletters to keep you up to date in terms of news following the PHRA as it moves through the House and Senate. And also stay tuned for phone zaps. There will be phone zaps all throughout the summer, reaching out to local representatives, both here in New York and across the country, in order to support this legislation until it is passed. And I can't wait to see our movement grow. This movement is for you if you are Filipino, if you are not Filipino, if you love Filipino and you are allied with Filipinos, if you are a worker, if you are Indigenous, and if you simply want to do something about empire from the seat of empire. And thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.